Welcome and hello to Recurrent Patterns, where we look at for interesting patterns in technology, business, and culture. I'm your host, Václav Vinčálek. Today on Recurrent Patterns, we will be talking about cities. And with me here today is my very special guest, Ron Blattman. Ron is the executive producer for Saving the City, remaking the American Metropolis TV series. Welcome to the show, Ron.
Thank you. Great. It's great to be here.
Thank you. Appreciate that. And so before we start talking about your TV show, before we start talking about you as an executive producer, if you can provide a little bit of context, how did you get to this point in your life?
Okay, so I'm a San Franciscan. I'm from the city of San Francisco. And for those of you in Vancouver, you guys will appreciate it with, another city with water and hills and beauty and great food and all kinds of different kinds of people living there. I'm from the city here, and I have been interested in building and frankly rebuilding cities ever since I was a little kid. So I started building models at age 6. I did a petition through neighborhood streets for traffic lights on a boulevard and sent it to the mayor when I was 9, and I was off to the races. And I wound up going to college, getting an architecture degree, and followed it up with 2 master's degrees in finance and city planning. Always with an idea to do something that was urban related. Most of my life professionally has been in the real estate world, but I always had sort of one foot in the public policy realm, especially when it had to do with cities. And so once I left being the head of business development in San Francisco in the mayor's office a long time ago, I look back and I had been lucky enough on various jobs to have been flown all over the US, looking at various cities and various markets. And I had also traveled a lot for fun, and I do a lot of reading. And, for better or for worse, I'm pretty familiar with every decent sized city on the continent, including in Canada. And I would see different things that different cities were being done, or they were doing for themselves to make themselves better. That had me really intrigued, because sometimes you would get very creative solutions in places you wouldn't expect. And the converse was true, is that a lot of times, and I know it in spades in my hometown of San Francisco, even with all of the money and the talent and the beauty and everything that we have here, we would do extraordinarily expensive, stupid things in the name of making ourselves better. And so I began thinking about, how do you sort of take some of these ideas that I saw elsewhere and bring them to the attention of people here? How do you take some of the things that happened here, both good and bad, and bring that to the attention of people elsewhere? And the idea was to sort of, create something that would be, I would say, an idea exchange, something along those lines. And then, of course, you have a series that's called Patterns on your podcasts. One discovers when they study cities, like many things, that there are patterns and patterns throughout history in terms of what happens, how things change, what people do, what people glom onto, what's the in thing at the moment, how cities develop. And so the idea was, so how do I reach the most amount of people and hopefully have an impact in showing them, when people try to make their city a better place, how to make it work and how to make it work better. And you do that by storytelling. And I thought doing it on video, if we're successful, will reach the most amount of people. So I came up with the idea to do a video series, which was aimed at TV, and it would have a curriculum attached to it. So it would be taught in schools, and it would also have a shelf life. It wouldn't just be, okay, it was aired or it was broadcast or it was what have you. It was actually it was a tool that people could use over time. And that's where the idea for the series, which is it's Saving the City, but the key part is the second part of the title, which is Remaking the American Metropolis. And I know you're in Vancouver, and for what it's worth, that includes Canada. And in fact, on our website, when we did some early shooting, and we have 3 mini stories on the website, one of those stories actually is set in Vancouver. And we have a lot of stories that I want to tell that are in Montreal, in Toronto, in Calgary, and in Vancouver. So we will be filming in Canada as well.
Beautiful, beautiful. And so let's start with, when you say cities should be better, because I think everybody can agree on what's wrong with their cities, but what does it mean that the city is better?
I think cities are better in a sense, and it's an interesting catch-22, and this catch-22 came about, frankly, in a long interview I did with actually Vancouver's former city planning director, who's quite famous in the profession, Larry Beasley, which is, why and why you strive to make your city more attractive. Because if it's more attractive and more desirable, it means you've made it a better, people want to be there. People want to be there, whether it's to work or whether it's to play or whether it's to live or whether it's to be educated or just to hang out. It's you want that. You want a place that's desirable. And so that's really what the idea is about. And not only that, I'm very interested personally in what does it take in a city, not just to say you're going to come and work there or play there or even live there for a time, but more importantly, what does it take so that people actually sink their roots into a city, become part of that city, and then become engaged in that city's current condition and also in its future? Because in a lot of places, especially in the New Yorks and the San Franciscos and the LAs of the world, you have a lot of people who, they attract people for obvious reasons, but they don't necessarily always stay in the city. They're there and they're there for 2 years or 3 years or 4 years. It's like you're part of the show. And then they go on, whether it's to the suburbs or in some cases to other places. And I'm interested in how do you keep these people so they become really true parts of a community? It's really how do you build permanent communities and cities that care about the quality of life in those places?
I cannot agree more. I definitely that resonates with me. And at the beginning, you mentioned that cities like San Francisco can spend incredible amount of money on stupid things. And I think that, again, anybody who's watching this will agree immediately or find tons of examples in their respective cities. So that's not that difficult. But if you can do it the other way, what would be the, I don't want to say cheap, but highly affordable thing to do within a city to create something, to create better place to live?
Well, I give an example of a city that transformed, it's not the one thing alone, and it's certainly got a long way to go, but I'll give you an example of something that was not a high budget expense comparatively that was transformative for a city. And it's a city that many people haven't been to. It's Birmingham, Alabama, which is a topographically surprisingly nice city. It's on rolling hills. Historically, it has its name Birmingham because of Birmingham, England, and the Industrial Revolution. Birmingham was a steel city. There's still there are still parts of one U.S. steel mill that are left, but for the most part, like everywhere else, the steel is gone. The biggest employer in Birmingham is the University of Alabama Birmingham's Medical Center, which is an enormous medical complex and fairly highly reputed medical complex of several hospitals just south of the downtown part of the city. And Birmingham has a downtown that is actually a fairly compact, built together downtown, surprisingly so for a city like Birmingham. Not as much life on the streets as one might like, but somebody came up with the idea a few years ago that, gee, well, what can we do, among other things, to enhance the quality of life here? And there is no river that runs through Birmingham. What they call their river are the 4 mainline railroad tracks that run on a slightly elevated concrete base on the south side of downtown that run east-west. And right on the other side of the tracks, literally, there were plans put in place to develop a new decent-sized city park in the heart of the city. And it's called Railroad Park. And it's a 19-acre park. And it has been wildly successful in terms of attracting all kinds of people and also in attracting development all around it, but also in changing the image of what the core of Birmingham's a city that's about 70% Black. And, the park is for everybody. One of the big concerns with the park was how to make everybody feel welcome there. There's a whole kind of art and science that it wasn't just a yuppie park, or it wasn't just an inner city park, or it wasn't just a visitor park, but it was something for everyone. And it's a park that was done compared to some other, unbelievably great parks that are going on all over the continent right now. The Railroad Park was done on a comparably shoestring budget. And it has still been incredibly successful and transformative. So it's one of those things where the idea really sort of is even more important than the money and the way that it was handled and what was done there. So, that's one place that I would point to that, what might surprise some people in terms of the level of sophistication that was done down there in Birmingham.
I think it's like with everything that, just because you have lots of money doesn't mean that you are smart. And sometimes necessity or lack of money will force you to think harder about what you're trying to do. And we talked a lot about, you know, the negative side of the cities, and everybody immediately can associate with traffic. And what have you seen in cities that they do something smart about traffic, if the word smart is appropriate here?
Well, you know, traffic is somewhat tied to what you do with transit. Not completely, but it's, you know, because obviously New York has the best, you know, 24-hour transit and subways, and New York is still congested. And in San Francisco, we have, for North America, a very high percentage of people that come in not on cars, but we're still you know, although our congestion, unlike what some of the things that are going on in the city right now, and you would think we would know better, but as usual, we don't, is the traffic in San Francisco is because people rely on bridges in large part, coming in from the north and coming from the east, to come into the city. I live in the middle of the city, and frankly, traffic within the city is not really a big deal because most people use transit. Yet when there is talk right now about congestion pricing zones and all the rest, it seems like the enemy are those of us who are in the city that take transit that might want to occasionally drive. When it's like, guys, have you ever stood on the street at rush hour and noticed that there really isn't that much traffic that's city bound? It's all lining up to get onto the freeway off ramps or onto the streets that are taking you to get out to the bridges, you know, but it's, you know, but people tend to go where it's easy to point a finger, which is one of the things we're trying to do with the series, is dig a little bit beyond the headlines. I mean, I'm not totally answering your question, but I think, you know, the transit part is a really important part of it. You know, the other side of that coin is there are cities for which there isn't a traffic problem, but that's usually because they wish there was, in the sense that they want that kind of vitality and energy, not necessarily the traffic problems, but the lack of traffic indicates that there's a lack of people and a lack of activity. And I'm talking pre-COVID, of course, but you know, that's sort of your catch-22. You don't want people stuck in traffic jams. At the same time, you don't want that commute to be so easy, because it's basically telling you there's nobody downtown, there's nobody in town that's there.
I think that definitely your point about traffic. I think that it's very visible. People can associate with noise, pollution, and all the negative things, and that they think that just to get people out of cars means that they restrict cars movement through cities, and usually that's only resurfacing a problem that the city is not properly architected, or the suburbs are not properly architected to allow for public transportation. I've been definitely not in many North American cities. I've been to some European cities, I've been through some Asian cities. And usually the quality of the public transportation is tied to density. Right, it's very difficult, very expensive to build public transportation if there is no density to service. I think that's, and also I think that the combination of different transportation modes it would be far useful than just banning everything outright.
I agree with that, and there's a corollary to that as well. And as a Canadian city, in fact, it's funny, somebody from Toronto just sent me a video that I looked at with somebody that's in Toronto. It's a Toronto story in which there's a guy there at their Board of Trade who has studied the bus systems and transit systems all over North America. And, you know, it's not a great surprise that almost all of them are downtown centric. The idea is to get people into the middle of town or the heart of town during the morning and get them out in the afternoon. And that's how the world works. When in today's polycentric city and in today's kind of things are spread out, even before COVID, things are in different directions, that if you want to get from, say, the northwest side of the city to the northeast side of the city, it shouldn't be that you have to go into the middle to then bounce all the way back up to go to the other corner, because that's completely inefficient. And that's why people drive. And part of what this guy in Toronto was doing was showing how Toronto had overhauled its complete transit system so that it is literally a grid in every direction. So that theoretically, I think, you know, their goal was to have strong transit links in every direction. Here in San Francisco, for example, we are very, very well served by transit in the overall picture. But if you want to go, and they redid the bus lines to make this better a few years ago, they've done it twice. But if you want to go from certain places to other certain places, it's much more difficult because the lines either there's not as many of them or they don't run as frequently. And, you know, in a dense environment, that's a really important thing. One of the things we're going to do a story on, for example, is the DART system, which is Dallas Area Rapid Transit. Dallas, for the moment, until LA outbuilds them, has more miles of light rail track than any city in the country, which would surprise people, which is one of the reasons I want to do that story. And what happened in Dallas was really simple, is they wanted to build, this is many years ago, they wanted to build a heavy rail, even subway system downtown in the city that would go in the city, but they could never get the political / which means the financial backing to get that done unless they threw in the whole county. So in order to get total buy-in, it was switched to a sprawling light rail system that went to the far-flung reaches of Dallas County. The only problem with that is Metro Dallas is relatively not dense. The core of Dallas is dense, but much of the city of Dallas is not dense, and certainly the suburbs are not dense. So they wound up building rail lines that go for many, 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 many miles without really traversing through that many people. And they had this odd circumstance of that they would show that their system ridership would go up each year, but on half their stations, they actually were losing riders in half their stations annually. And the reason that you had the total number of riders go up is because they would make the system go even further out. So you would build more stations, but the ones that you built were losing people. And one of the things that, you know, I'm interested in taking a look at is, it's an interesting question, is it's a catch-22, because everybody would say, well, Dallas really should invest in some sort of a transit system. So it's a chicken and egg situation. Do you wait until you have the density and then you lay the tracks, if you will? Or do you do it the way Dallas did and then you densify around those tracks and you project out 20, 30 years in the future? And if they did their transit-oriented development right, and if they developed along the rail line, you know, if you will, correctly, that they, you know, they basically built the system to be able to handle that. And, you know, it's a really interesting thing because LA is trying something different, which is LA is actually surprisingly dense. LA City in particular is surprisingly dense, especially in the core from downtown all the way out to the ocean, which is 20 miles. And they are in the middle of spending billions of dollars to keep expanding their light rail system. And, you know, so in that, and they are allowing enormously dense projects at their stations. And LA is doing everything. If you looked at a textbook, they're doing everything right. But here's the conundrum. LA has been losing rail ridership for 5 years running. And you scratch your head and you go, how's this possible? It's dense, it's crowded. It is building at all the stations, you know, 10 and 12 and sometimes 20 and 30-story buildings for density to be at the stations. They're doing everything right. And yet they're losing riders. And, you know, there's a bunch of reasons that have been put forth for that, which are, you know, really, and it sort of makes it like, you know, how do you deal with this? One of the things I've read, or a couple of things I've read as to why those numbers are going down is as the general economy was improving. So what happens in LA is obviously LA is still a big sprawling mess. And if you really want to get around, separate from if you do a commute by taking some sort of transit, you would still need a car. I mean, just whether it's groceries or whatever you're doing, you would still need a car. So when the economy has been improving and you're going through with these transit lines into poorer neighborhoods, well, if the economy is improving and there's more money for people to spend, the first thing they're going to do is a sign of having made it is to buy a car. And because it's a sign of actually having made it. So now these people have cars. So now these people are driving. And of course, you know, you don't want to say, well, only rich people can drive and other people can't drive. So it's a really interesting conundrum. Another part of it was that if the rail comes in, does it gentrify certain areas? And does that then mean that there's more people driving? So it's a catch-22 in a sense with what you do with it. And then you have the people that are going to raise the question that in today's world where you've got the Ubers and the Lyfts and what have you, do you even want fixed rail? Is everybody going to go to this on-demand model? Although the economies of that have yet to really prove out, because if you take a look at, you know, Uber loses still, you know, billions of dollars per quarter. And
correct,
all the
yes.
rest, you know, and so the question is, how long is that going to be sustainable? And is that really a model for, you know, for going forward? Can you really do that? And can you also move the amounts of people that like a New York subway or a Vancouver the trains or, the Toronto subway or the Chicago or the San Francisco subway is what they can move in terms of an hour, in terms of people.
Right. And it's still not enough, right? When there is the peak hours, you cannot even get properly on in metro, or in right. Vancouver, it's called SkyTrain.
Yeah. Although that, who knows post-COVID if with the staggered work hours or the people coming in 2 or 3, if it takes hold coming in 2 or 3 or 4 days a week, if that is going to, it's going to potentially flatten the demand curve, but it may also spread it out so that you could have theoretically a rush hour that runs all day long. So your rush hour might be 20% less, but it might be all day long. So if you're a transit agency, you have to adapt to, rather than just 3 hours of peak and, in the morning and in the night, you might have to have a kind of slightly less than peak, but it may be all day. I'm not saying it will be, but it could be theoretically all day long.
Do you understand, do you appreciate the fact that we're creating a historical document where we're using the term COVID, which, a few years down the road, people will be watching this and saying, I have no idea what these guys are talking about. Yeah, I read about it, but I don't know what it means now.
Maybe they think it's covert. They think it's like, that we're doing something secretly to make it really mysterious.
Yes. In 2021, we're talking about COVID-19. Yes, interesting. And so this is, I think, that many things which you describe talk about the counterintuitive things with there is the counterintuitive things where you expect that you build something and suddenly it doesn't work out the way you were expecting, or in your series, in your TV series, was there something which you thought it must be like this and that we're going to build story around that, and it turned completely the opposite way?
Not completely yet, mainly because it's sort of cheating, but I do my homework before I choose the story, so I kind of know what the result is. Mm-hmm. That, in other words, that's what I'm trying to illustrate are some of the experiences with those kinds of things. I think that let me just think, in some ways, I'm trying to think of an example of something that really surprised people. I mean, one thing that people knew would be successful, but had no idea it would be anywhere near successful, was the High Line in New York, the park that runs in the old elevated train tracks that were freight trains. People,
very much so.
People didn't know what it was going to happen there and all the rest. They had no idea. And now the High Line is attracting, it's like literally geometrically more than what they ever projected. It's millions of people a year. It's more than what I used to say. I used to say it was 5 million people a year that they were getting. The last number I saw is well in excess of that. And, it is incredibly popular, incredibly crowded. And the real estate all along the High Line has become some of the highest priced residential real estate per square foot in Manhattan, which is, which is astonishing. And nobody foresaw that. That wasn't something that anybody foresaw. I mean, maybe somebody had a dream that this was going to be a nice park or a nice experience or a good thing for the west side of the city there in Chelsea and up above. But I don't think anybody thought that this was going to lead to the kind of boom. And what it's done is, and this is a pattern story, is it has helped, along with other things, but it has helped usher in an era of a tremendous amount of investment in parks and open space in cities all over the continent, all over the world, in fact. Not just there's the quality of life part, but there is also the second part of it, which is it can also be used as an economic tool. So in Atlanta, they took 4 railroad segments that comprised 22 miles that were connected together that looped the city. It's called the Atlanta Beltline. And, the idea was it's sort of a high line, except it's not really elevated per se, or elevated like it was in New York. And the idea was a walking trail and a biking trail and a jogging trail. But what has happened is it just kicked off an absolute real estate boom wherever it's gone. And so now that it's going into the lower income west side of the city, there are a lot of provisions in place to try and keep people from being kicked out of their longtime homes, that the prices have gone up. But it's an economic development tool. In Oklahoma City, which is a very surprising city, given how many things they have done to change their course, if you will. And I mean, I'm going to film a lot of stories in Oklahoma City because they've been lucky enough to have a series of very far-sighted mayors and people in city government there. But they opened last year a year and a half ago, a park called Scissortail Park downtown, which is 70 acres of a central park that was literally created downtown. And the idea was not only to create the park, but to ring the park with high density housing. And on one side is the new convention center and a convention hotel, but that the value for that housing would be created by overlooking the park, by that you're downtown and you have this big green space in front of you. And instead of the usual, it's 2 blocks or it's 4 blocks in Oklahoma City, it's a city that has a lot of land, but they made it a 70-acre park. I mean, that's a pretty gutsy thing to do, and that's transformative. I mean, that's a really big deal. They moved Interstate 40, which is a major east-west trunk line in the US. They moved it a mile south in order to create room for that park and some other things to take place, which is no small cost to move an 8-lane interstate freeway that's running through the heart of your city. That's, a major east-west connector. And you see that.
And these are beautiful stories, because stories like that definitely shows that there's future for the city. Because whether people like it or not, we are moving more and more to cities because there are better opportunities. There are more people. You mentioned that you can study there, you can live there. You have the economy of scale, and this is what's exciting, and what I really like about all the things you were talking about, that there is always the positivity in it, right? It's easy for people to find the negative space and saying this doesn't work, this is bad, but it's not true. There are so many good positive things which the cities are trying to do, and I hope that your series will help people to go and learn what other people do in their cities and try to implement in their cities.
Well, the idea is so that people can learn from that. And the other thing is to spur people to get involved in their own community when they see that in other cities, wow, we thought you couldn't fight City Hall, or we thought you couldn't get this done. For those people whose only diet is Fox News or the kleptocracy that used to inhabit Washington, they think that everybody's on the take or everybody's incompetent, which is frankly at the national level what we've seen. Mm-hmm. But at the local level, it's a much different thing. I mean, even right now, and this will date this, but even right now, when you have the big stimulus plan, is that some of the strongest proponents for the stimulus plan, it's universal among local government officials in the states. It doesn't matter Republican or Democrat. The Republican mayors are just as excited about this as the Democratic mayors, and also they come out and say so. The noise is in Washington, but at the local level, they know what needs to get done. I mentioned Oklahoma City. I'll mention it on this. Oklahoma City is a red city. It is a Republican city. It is Republican sliced north, south, east, west. The state government, the city government, everybody is Republican. Starting in 1994, so that'll make it for the last 27 years as of today, they have voted to tax themselves 4 times for capital improvements all throughout the city. And you scratch your head and you go, wait a minute, Republican mayors, Republican governors, Republican populists, and these guys are voting to tax themselves repeatedly? And they did it. And interestingly enough, they did a thing. I mean, there's a whole long story behind this, but after 3 straight, one of them was for schools, 2 of them were lots of capital improvements around specifically downtown. They passed one last November, not this past one, but the November before that, was called MAPS 4, it's Metropolitan Area Projects. And the mayor there, who's a great guy currently, David Holt, I mean, he said to me, he's that, people have seen all that money go into downtown and that was great and all the rest, but we need to get out and get it out into the people. So they went out and they canvassed the community, and they came back with 16 items that were on the list. And this would make anybody, if they have a stereotype of what a Republican city would look like, they would blush. Money for the homeless, money for healthcare, money for education, money for recreation, money for education. And you sort of scratch your head and you go, wait a minute, this is, money for drug intervention. This is like, this is a Republican mayor in a Republican city saying, will you tax yourselves to do this? And at the local level, I think they did it by the number was, I believe it was in the high 70s was the vote, you know, was the high 70%. Now, Oklahoma City can do it in part because each mayor in the last couple of decades has had a metropolitan area projects under their belt. They always deliver pretty much on time and on budget on all the projects that they set out. That's what happens when you hit turn the ringer off. The phone still rings.
No, this is perfect.
But that's the kind of stuff that I want to illustrate. And what it really tells us also in this time of, you know, when people are in despair and despondent, is there's a lot more that unites people if you just turn away from the loudmouths on certain, you know, right-wing radio and right-wing television and what have you. If you say a lot more that unites people than divides people, people basically want the same things. And at the local level, people are all over the US and in Canada and elsewhere, they are banding together to get things done at the local level.
Yeah. So Ron, where can people find all the TV series, all the movies you were talking about?
Okay, so right now we are finishing editing the opening 2 episodes in the series, but we have started this week putting up what will be a series of 6 to 10 minute videos with particular stories on them. And it's at savingthecity.org, just the website, saving with a G, savingthecity.org. And we have a video that includes a story that compares downtown schools in Vancouver to no downtown school in a new development in San Francisco. And that's stuff that is part of our preview video, but we have a new story that is just going up now about how do cities maintain cultural continuity when neighborhoods change. And we are telling the story of the famous playwright August Wilson, who grew up in the Hill District of Pittsburgh. And the Hill District in Pittsburgh was a neighborhood that used to have 55,000 people. Today it has 9,000 people. His house was a ruin, but people in the family bought it, and they are transforming it after many years into a sort of living cultural center, and a couple of other places in the Hill that are touchstones as well. So we tell the story about the Hill District and August Wilson and the August Wilson house. And then we are finishing up a second story that will be up in a couple of weeks about a neighborhood in Philadelphia that sort of defied the norm of redevelopment in the US, in which it was designed back in the late 50s and early 60s in the middle of frankly, a lousy neighborhood in Philadelphia. It was designed to be a middle-class, mixed-race homeowner community. And it, you know, there's some interesting twists and turns, but it was built out and it was a successful community. And there's some interesting twist to that, but it was, you know, to sort of tell a story about that. Again, when you look back on some things historically about how to make cities better, there are all kinds of stories about different kinds of experiences that people can learn from. And then we've got a piece coming up on homelessness in Skid Row in LA. And we have a whole series of other videos that we are going to be putting up every 2 to 3 weeks going forward. So that, and then we are on all the social media platforms now too. We're on Instagram, we're on LinkedIn, we're on Facebook, we're on, you know, I'm new to the social media world, but we're also on Pinterest, and we even now have a Twitter feed. So I have to learn about Twitter.
Amazing, right? I know, but definitely, you know, I think that this is definitely worthwhile cause because it affects, you know, according to the latest number, 75% of people on this planet living in cities. Everybody's moving there, most people moving there. And we have to learn how to do it better all the time and learn from each other, from the examples, what worked, what didn't work. So thank you very much for doing all this, and we definitely will help you to spread the word, if you will. So
thank you. No, thank you so much for having me. I appreciate that, and a shout out to Jonathan for introducing us.
Totally, yes. I will buy him beer. Okay. So that's it for now. Thank you very much, Ron. I appreciate your time. For all the viewers and listeners, thank you for staying with us. And that's it for Recurrent Patterns. I'm your host, Václav Inčálek, and all the links which we were talking about will be in the text below the videos with the podcast, everywhere Recurrent Patterns are consumed. Thank you. Enjoy. Talk soon. Bye-bye.